I was sitting on my front porch in Portland, watching the rain fall on my tomato plants. The drops made soft sounds on the leaves. My hands held a cup of hot chocolate that had gone cold. It was 7 in the morning. This was usually my happy time of day. I would water my flowers and think about nice things. But today felt strange. My chest felt tight like someone was sitting on it. The wind chimes near the door made quiet music. They were the only sounds keeping me company since I stopped working at the post office. I had worked there for 35 years. I sorted letters and packages. I knew everyone's address by heart. But I never thought about what happens when your own story gets lost in the mail. The phone was on the small table next to me. It was glowing with a message. I stared at my son Brian's name on the screen for 5 whole minutes before I felt brave enough to touch it. My hands were shaking. I was mad at myself for being scared. Why should a mom be scared to talk to her own child? Press the button. "Hello, Brian," I said. My voice sounded weak and thin, like paper that might rip if I talked too loud. "Hey, Mom," he said back. I could hear noise behind him. Glasses clinking together. People laughing. Fancy music playing softly. Sounded expensive. Sounded like a place I would never get to visit. "Look, I'm calling because I wanted to tell you myself before you see pictures online. We did it. Sarah and I got married yesterday at her parents' lake house." The air went out of my lungs. Felt like someone punched me in the stomach. Yesterday. That word felt like a brick hitting my head. I looked at my calendar on the wall. I had circled the wedding date with a red marker months ago. Brian told me they were still picking a date. I had bought a pretty green dress from the store. Cost me $200. I had been saving for it. The dress was still hanging in my closet with the tag on it. A dress that would never get worn. "You got married," I whispered. My voice was so quiet. "Yeah, yesterday," Brian said. He cleared his throat. I could hear that he was uncomfortable. He sounded cold and mean, like Sarah's family had taught him to be. "We wanted to keep it small, Mom. The Hartwell family, well, they had very specific ideas about how everything should look. They wanted a certain kind of party. Clean. Perfect. You know how it is. They thought having too many different types of people there would mess up the vibe. Sarah's parents just fit better with the whole thing. They understand fancy stuff. It was private, just for people who really belonged there." Belonged. That word kept playing in my head over and over. I thought about the 40 years I spent working extra hours at the post office so Brian could go to good schools. I thought about all the winters when I wore my old torn jacket so he could have new shoes and a new computer. I thought about how a boy who never knew what it felt like to be poor. I thought about the night his dad died from a bad heart in our kitchen. I held Brian for hours and hours that night. I promised him I would always be there. I promised he would never be alone. I was good enough to pay for his whole life. But I wasn't good enough to watch him get married. "I understand," I said. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep inside me for tears. It felt cold and numb, starting in my bones and moving out. "You didn't think I would fit in with how everything looked." "It's not like that, Mom," he said. His voice got louder and annoyed. "Don't make this into a big drama. It was just about planning. We're going to have a small lunch for other family members this summer. You'll come to that. It'll be easier for you. Less stressful. Small lunch. The leftovers of his love." I looked at my hands. They had brown spots from getting older. My nails were short and plain. These hands had cleaned his rooms. These hands had turned pages of bedtime stories for him. These hands had saved every penny in a special account that he took all the money from when he turned 26. "Is Sarah happy?" Yes. I don't know why I cared. Maybe I just wanted the story to have a good ending. "She's so happy, Mom," Brian said. I could hear real love in his voice. The same love he used to have for me when he was little. "But listen, there's another reason I'm calling. The wedding was amazing, but we had a money problem. The Hartwell family had some trouble getting to their cash at the last minute. Some of their bank accounts got locked for a check. It's not serious. Just bad timing." Closed my eyes. I knew what was coming next. This was a story I had heard too many times before. The place where we had the wedding and the food people need to be paid by noon today. He kept talking. The total is $65,000. I told Sarah not to worry. I told her my mom always helps me. Just a loan. Obviously, when the Hartwell family fixes their bank stuff, they'll pay you back with extra money on top. I just sent you the bill in an email. You can send the money from your savings account, right? Urgent, Mom. The wedding place manager is being really mean about it. $65,000. That number hung in the air like a heavy cloud. It was almost exactly how much money I had left in my special savings account. It was my safety blanket. The money I saved so I wouldn't have to ask Brian for help when I got too old to walk well or when my house roof started leaking. He was asking for my survival money to pay for a party I wasn't allowed to go to. I opened my computer. The email was there. It was from a fancy wedding planner in Lake Oswego. The logo looked shiny and expensive. The total at the bottom was written in clean letters that made the huge bill look almost pretty. $65,000. For flowers that would die in one day. For champagne that people would forget about by tomorrow morning. For the worthiness of a family that couldn't even pay their own bills. Mom, are you still there? Brian asked. I thought back to a rainy Thursday 15 years ago. Brian was 14. He wanted a special jacket for a school dance. A black leather one that cost $400. I didn't have $400. I worked extra hours every night for 6 weeks at the post office loading trucks until my arms hurt so badly. All so I could see him walk out the door feeling like he belonged. I remembered how he looked at me then. His eyes were full of pride. He told me I was the best mom in the whole world. Where did that boy go? Was he buried under layers of Sarah's expensive dresses and the Hartwell family's fake importance? The rain in Portland doesn't just fall. Settles. Finds the cracks in the sidewalk. The gaps in the bricks. The hollow spaces in a person's chest. I sat by the window in my living room. I watched the water drops race down the glass. Blurred lines of gray against a gray world. The phone was quiet now, but it felt like a bomb on the coffee table. I had hung up on Marcus, the wedding planner. And by doing that, I had cut a wire I didn't know was holding my whole world together. For 35 years, I was the woman who sorted the mail, who organized the chaos, who made sure every letter got to the right house. But now my own story was scattered on the floor, and the pages were torn beyond repair. I looked at my hands again. They were red and dry from the cold morning air. My mind, without me wanting it to, slipped backward, slid through the years like a movie getting stuck. 15 years ago. It was a Thursday much like this one. Cold and mean. Brian was 14. A skinny kid with eyes that still looked at me like I was the sun. He had come home with a paper about the school dance. His face was glowing with quiet hope. He wanted a leather jacket. Not a used one from the thrift shop on Burnside, but a real jacket. A $400 jacket from the mall downtown. I remembered how much money was in my bank account that night. $11. I didn't tell him no. I never told him no. I took a second job loading delivery trucks at the post office at night. Another 4 hours cleaning tables at a diner near the river. I remembered the smell of that diner. Old grease and cheap soap stuck to my skin. A smell I could never quite wash away. I worked until my back felt like broken glass. I worked until my eyes burned from the bright lights and the dust of packages. And when I finally walked into that store and counted out the wrinkled 20s and 10s, I felt like a queen. I remembered the way he looked in that black leather jacket. He stood in this very living room. He was looking at himself in the mirror. His chest puffed out with new confidence. He turned to me. His eyes were wet with a child's pure gratitude. He whispered, "Mom, you're the best. One day I'm going to buy you a mansion. I'm going to make sure you never have to work again." That boy was a ghost now. He had been replaced by a man who saw my 40 years of work not as a gift but as something he deserved. He had been replaced by a man who thought my savings account was just another package he could open and empty to keep himself comfortable. The phone vibrated. A notification flashed. It was an email from Brian. But the subject line wasn't an apology. It was urgent payment instructions. Opened it. The nerve of the words made the room feel smaller. "Mom. Marcus said there was a mix-up. I don't have time for this. We are literally at the gate waiting to board for Hawaii. Sarah is stressed and Victoria, her mother, is already asking questions. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? The Hartwell family expects things to be handled with class. You're making me look like a child. Just send the money. I'll explain everything when we get back. Please, for once, don't be stubborn. Don't be stubborn." The words felt like a slap across my face. I was stubborn because I wouldn't empty my bank account for a party I wasn't good enough to attend. I thought back to the engagement party 8 months ago. The Hartwell house in Lake Oswego was a huge glass building that screamed money and ego. I had worn my best flowered dress, the one I saved for special days. When I walked in, Victoria Hartwell looked at me like I was dirt on her clean floor. She didn't introduce me to the guests. She didn't give me a seat at the main table. Instead, a waiter had guided me to a tiny table tucked behind a big plant near the kitchen doors. "It's quieter back here, Linda," Victoria had whispered. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "We thought you'd be more comfortable away from all the noise. It's a lot of social stuff to handle, isn't it?" I had sat there for 5 hours. I watched my son laugh with men in expensive suits. I watched him toast to a future that didn't include the woman who had cleaned grease for his jacket. I had seen him look toward my table once. A quick, embarrassed flick of his eyes before he turned back to Sarah, hiding his past in a glass of fancy wine. I had stayed quiet then. I told myself it was for his happiness. I told myself that a mother's job was to be the bridge, even if the people walking on it never looked down at the stones holding them up. But the bridge was falling apart now. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. My movements were stiff and slow. I looked at the coffee pot on the counter. The one Brian had bought me for Christmas 7 years ago. The last gift he had given me that wasn't a request for money. It was a cheap thing. Probably bought at a drugstore on his way home. But I had loved it. Picked it up. I threw it into the trash can. The sound of the plastic hitting the bin was hollow and unsatisfying. Why did he think I would say yes? Was it because I had always said yes? I had taught him that my love was a bottomless well. And now he was confused that he had finally hit the dirt at the bottom. I went to the basement. I found the old box of his childhood things. I pulled out the black leather jacket. It was tiny now. A miniature version of the man he had become. The fabric was stiff. The cheap fake leather was scratchy under my fingers. I remembered the blisters on my feet from that diner job. I remembered how my heart had flown when he said he loved me. I realized with crushing clarity that I had raised him to be a consumer of my soul. I had been so busy protecting him from the world that I had never taught him how to be part of mine. The phone rang again. This time it wasn't a text. It was a call from Brian. I knew he was at the airport. I knew he was probably pacing near the big windows, looking out at the planes, his face tight with spoiled anger. Answered it. "Mom, what the hell?" he shouted. His voice was raw, stripped of the polite mask he usually wore. "Marcus called me back. He said you refused to pay. He said you told him to talk to the Hartwell family. Do you have any idea what you've done? Victoria is standing right here. Sarah is in the bathroom crying. This was supposed to be the best day of our lives and you're ruining it over a stupid bank transfer." "The best day of your life, Brian," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. It was steady. It was cold. It was the voice of a post office worker telling someone their package was lost. I wouldn't know. I wasn't there. "Oh, for God's sake. We went over this. It was a small ceremony. It wasn't about you, Mom. Why do you always have to make everything about your feelings? The Hartwell family are important people. They have a reputation. If this bill isn't paid, it's going to be all over the Portland social media pages. Sarah will be humiliated. Is that what you want? To humiliate your daughter-in-law on her honeymoon?" "My daughter-in-law," I repeated. "The woman who hasn't said a single word to me in 4 months. The woman who looked at my house like it was a garbage dump. I don't think she cares about my opinion, Brian. She cares about how things look. And so do you. Mom, just pay the damn bill. I'll pay you back. Swear. Just empty the savings account. You don't even need that money right now. You're sitting in a house that's fully paid for. You have your retirement check. You're being selfish, Linda. You're being incredibly selfish." Selfish. The boy I had carried. The boy I had sheltered. The boy I had worked 3 jobs for. He was calling me selfish because I wanted to keep enough money to buy my own food when I turned 80. I looked at the mountain through the window. A sharp point of light cutting through the gray sky. "Brian," I said. The silence on the other end was heavy with his expectation that I would give in. I sorted 1,000,000 packages in my career. I organized the deliveries of geniuses and fools. And you know what the most common theme in every tragedy is? I don't care about packages right now, Mom. The theme is pride, I continued, ignoring him. The belief that you are the center of the universe and everyone else is just background noise in your story. You and the Hartwell family think you're important. You think money is the same as character. But importance isn't something you buy with a $65,000 catering bill. Something you earn through loyalty. It's something you earn by showing up for the people who showed up for you. Are you done with the speech? Because the gate is closing. I was done a long time ago, Brian. I was done the moment you told me I wouldn't fit in at your wedding. I was done the moment you asked me to pay for a life that excludes me. I am not paying the bill. Not today. Not when you get back. Never. You're dead to me, he hissed. The poison in his voice was so pure it made my skin crawl. I hope you enjoy your money, Mom. I hope it keeps you warm in that dusty old house when you're all alone. Because you've lost your son. Over $65,000. You've lost your only family. No, Brian, I said. A single tear finally broke free and rolled down my cheek. Not out of sadness but out of a deep sense of relief. I lost my son a long time ago. I just didn't realize he'd been replaced by a stranger until the stranger asked for my life savings. Enjoy Hawaii. I hope the champagne was worth it. Hung up. I didn't wait for his response. I didn't wait to hear the boarding announcement in the background. I turned off the phone. I placed it face down on the counter. The silence came back to the kitchen. But it didn't feel heavy anymore. Felt clean. I looked at the calendar on the wall. I took a red marker. I didn't just cross out the date. I ripped the whole page off and threw it in the trash. I walked to the living room. I sat back in the chair. I felt the physical weight of the memories. Of that diner. Post office. The long nights of sorting packages. I had spent so many years trying to make sure that Brian was important in the eyes of the world. I had polished him, dressed him, funded him until he shined. But in my rush to make him look like a masterpiece, I had forgotten to check if the canvas was hollow. And it was. He was a hollow man filled only with the borrowed importance of a family that didn't even pay their own catering bills. I looked at the photos on the shelf. I saw the Hartwell family's faces in the background of the engagement photo. Victoria with her tight fake smile. Her husband Richard with his cold calculating eyes. They were a family of illusions. They were a family that lived on credit and vanity. And Brian had traded a mother's iron devotion for a seat at their crumbling table. I realized then that the importance Brian kept talking about was a debt that could never be settled. If I had paid the $65,000 today, there would have been another bill tomorrow. A down payment for a house. A luxury car. Private school fees for children who would be taught to be ashamed of their grandmother. I would have drained myself dry drop by drop. And in the end, I would still be sitting behind the plant at the party, invisible and uninvited. The rain started to hit against the house now. True Portland storm. The wind howled through the corners of my Craftsman home, shaking the old windows. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I realized I was hungry. I hadn't eaten since the call. I made myself a simple meal. Toast with butter and a fresh cup of tea. It wasn't a fancy plated dinner. It wasn't high-end or perfect. But it was mine. As I ate, I thought about the wedding. I imagined the moment the Hartwell family would find out the bill was still not paid. I imagined Marcus calling the estate, demanding payment. I imagined the look on Victoria's face when she realized her bank accounts wouldn't cover the cost of the flowers. I felt a small dark spark of satisfaction. But it quickly faded into a tired peace. Their drama was no longer my catalog. Their stories were no longer on my shelves. I was Linda Foster. I had $68,000. I had a house that smelled like old wood and rain. And for the first time in 40 years, I wasn't waiting for a boy to come home and tell me I was the son. I was my own son. I was my own anchor. I looked at the green dress in the box by the door. I had spent so much time worrying about the flow and the atmosphere of a world that didn't want me. I had spent so much time trying to be worthy of a son who didn't even know the value of the hands that raised him. I went to the library that afternoon. Not to work but to read. I sat in the big reading room of the Portland Central Library under the high ceilings. I breathed in the scent of paper and wisdom. I realized that I had spent my life surrounded by the greatest stories ever told. Stories of sacrifice, betrayal, and redemption. And in every one of them, the main character only truly finds themselves when they stop playing a supporting role in someone else's delusion. I opened a book of poetry. I read a line about the ocean. About how it doesn't apologize for its waves. Smiled. I wasn't an aesthetic. I wasn't a planning decision. I was a force of nature that had been held back for too long. When I walked home through the drizzle, my coat damp and my heart light, I saw a black car parked outside my house. My heart skipped a beat. Brian. Had he come back? Had he skipped his flight? But it wasn't Brian. A woman stepped out of the car. She was dressed in an expensive raincoat. Her hair was perfectly styled despite the rain. It was Victoria Hartwell. She looked at my house with that same pitying smile. But there was something else in her eyes now. Desperation. "Linda," she said. Her voice was tight and forced. "We need to talk. There seems to have been a technical problem with the wedding finances. Brian said you were being a bit emotional this morning. I'm sure we can settle this like civil adults." I stood on my porch looking down at her. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel unworthy. I looked at the mountain behind her, sharp and unyielding. "Victoria," I said. My voice was as calm as a frozen lake. "You're right. We should settle this. But you're at the wrong house. My son told me you were the worthy ones. And worthy people always pay their own way, don't they?" I walked inside, closed the door. I locked it. I turned off the porch light. In the silence of my home, I sat down and picked up my pen. I didn't write a check. I didn't write a letter to my son. I wrote a list of places I wanted to see. Paris, Rome, the libraries of London. I had spent my life sorting the packages of others. It was finally time to write my own chapter. The $65,000 was still in the bank. But the debt I had owed to my own misplaced guilt was finally completely paid in full. The silence that followed Victoria Hartwell's departure was not a peaceful one. It was a vacuum. A hollow, ringing space that felt like the air had been sucked out of my house, leaving me gasping for something real to hold on to. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the rain beat against the heavy wooden door I had just locked. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, but my mind was a cold, quiet post office. I realized then that I had spent 35 years organizing the world into zip codes, believing that if everything had a place, then everything would make sense. But there is no code for the betrayal of a child. There is no section in the files for a son who sells his mother's survival for a seat at a table made of smoke. I walked through the rooms of my home, my footsteps sounding like echoes from a different time. The house felt like a museum of a life that had been torn apart piece by piece. I looked at the wallpaper in the dining room, a faded pattern that Brian had once helped me pick out when he was 18. He had laughed at my uncertainty, telling me that whatever I chose would be beautiful because I was the one who chose it. Now those patterns looked like faded eyes watching me in my isolation. I was a bank to him. I was a resource. I was a planning error in a high-end aesthetic. The phone sat on the kitchen counter, dead and black. I had turned it off. But I could still feel the phantom buzzing of his rage. I could still hear his voice. That stranger's voice calling me selfish. Selfish. The word tasted like metal in my mouth. I thought of the grease under my fingernails from the diner. I thought of the dust in my lungs from the post office warehouse. I thought of the thousands of miles I had walked in sensible, cheap shoes so he could drive a car that cost more than my first 10 years of wages. The irony was a sharp blade. I had built a man who was now using the very tools I gave him to cut me out of his heart. Driven by a restless, gnawing need for clarity, I did something I had never done before. I put on my old raincoat, grabbed my keys, and drove out of my neighborhood. I didn't have a plan, only a destination. I drove toward the shores of the Columbia River, toward the neighborhood where the ceremony had taken place 2 days ago. I needed to see it. I needed to see the atmosphere that was worth $65,000 of my blood and bone. The house was a huge glass and wood building tucked behind high iron gates covered in ivy. I parked my old Honda across the street. A dented gray car in a sea of perfect black pavement. The iron gates were closed, but I could see through the bars. The party was over. The worthy guests were gone. But the remnants were still there, like the bones of a feast left out for the birds. I got out of the car. I stood in the drizzle, looking at the lawn. There were white flower petals scattered across the grass, turning brown and soggy in the Portland rain. A stack of rented chairs stood under a dripping tent, their gold-painted frames looking cheap and ugly in the daylight. I saw a program lying in a puddle near the gate. I reached through the bars and picked it up. The Foster Hartwell wedding. The paper was heavy, cream-colored with gold edges. Inside there was a list of names. A list of people who fit the flow. I saw the names of politicians, business owners, socialites. And then I saw the family section. The parents of the bride, Richard and Victoria Hartwell. The groom's family, represented by the Hartwell household. My name was nowhere to be found. I wasn't even a footnote. I had been erased from the official record of my son's life as if I had never existed. It wasn't just that I wasn't invited. It was that I had been scrubbed away to make room for the Hartwell family's story of effortless, pure prestige. They wanted a groom who came from nowhere. A man who had sprung fully formed from a world of status. Not a boy who was raised in a small house by a widow with chapped hands. I stood there clutching the soggy program and felt a cold, deep fury settle into my stomach. It wasn't the hot rage of the morning. It was a postal worker's fury. The kind you feel when you realize a precious letter has been intentionally destroyed. I looked at the estate. At the towering windows that Brian had bragged about. And I saw the hollow truth of it. This was the mansion he had promised me when he was 14. He had bought it. But he had locked me outside the gates. I drove home in a daze. The wipers on my car clicking like a clock for my grief. But as I passed the University of Portland, a thought flickered in my mind. Postal worker's instinct. If the Hartwell family was so wealthy, if they were so worthy, why was their cash frozen for a routine check? Why was Victoria Hartwell standing on my porch in the rain, practically begging for $65,000? Checks of that size don't happen to the stable. They happen to the crumbling. When I got back to my house, I didn't go to bed. I went to my small study. I opened my laptop. I spent 35 years researching for people who didn't know how to look beneath the surface. I knew how to navigate the public records, the property files, the court documents. I began to look for the name Richard Hartwell. Took me 5 hours. The deeper I went, the more the aesthetic began to peel away like cheap paint. Richard Hartwell wasn't a business owner. He was a shell. He owned a series of companies that were a tangled web of debt and lawsuits. I found a public notice for a foreclosure on a property in West Lynn, the very neighborhood where Brian and Sarah were planning to buy a house. I found a tax problem from the IRS for nearly $600,000. And then I found the most telling piece of evidence. A lawsuit from a catering company in Eugene filed 8 months ago for failure to pay for services. The Hartwell family wasn't wealthy. They were con artists. They were a family of ghosts living in a house of cards, desperately trying to find a new foundation to build upon. And they had found it in my son. They had seen his ambition, his hunger for a world he didn't understand. And they had groomed him to be the next line of credit. The $65,000 wasn't for a problem. It was the only way they could keep the illusion alive for one more day. They were using my retirement money to pay for the mask they wore while they looked down on me. I sat back in my chair, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my glasses. The betrayal felt even heavier now. Brian hadn't just chosen a new family. He had chosen a lie. He had traded the iron grease-stained truth of my life for a hollow gold-edged fantasy. And the most heartbreaking part was that he probably didn't even know. Or worse, he did know, and he was so desperate to belong to that fantasy that he was willing to empty his own mother's bank account to keep the lie from shattering. I looked at the mountain through the window, sharp, cold shape in the night. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy fog that covered the city. I felt like I was at the bottom of a deep, dark well. The void was complete. My son was gone, lost to a world of shadows and debt. My house was empty. My bank account was intact. But my heart was a ruin. I thought about the lunch Brian had mentioned. More your speed. He wanted me to come to a cheap restaurant in a few months after the excitement had settled so he could pat me on the head and tell me I was still his mom. He wanted to keep me on a leash of guilt and affection while he and Sarah played house in a world they couldn't afford. The phone buzzed. I had turned it back on. A mistake of habit. It was a text from Brian. "Mom, Victoria told me what you said." I can't believe you were so cruel to her. She's trying to welcome you into our circle and you threw her out like trash. We're in Hawaii now. But Sarah hasn't stopped crying. The venue is threatening to send the bill to collections. If that happens, our credit is ruined before we even start. Do you really hate me this much? Is $65,000 more important to you than your only son's future? Just send the money, please. I'm begging you. Don't let the Hartwell family see us like this. Don't let the Hartwell family see us like this. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about his standing in a house of cards. He was worried that the con artists would realize he wasn't as deep a well as they had hoped. I didn't reply. Couldn't. The words were thick, choking smoke in my throat. I went to the kitchen. I stood over the sink, staring at the drain. I remembered a day when Brian was 9. He had fallen off his skateboard and cut his arm badly. I had carried him 4 blocks home, my own back aching, and I had cleaned the wound, telling him that it would leave a scar but he would be stronger for it. He had looked at me with such complete trust, such pure love. Where was that boy? Was he still in there, buried under the pride and the silk? Or had the Hartwell family systematically erased him, just as they had erased my name from the wedding program? The realization of his complete transformation hit me with the force of a wave. I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, my knees hitting the tile with a dull thud. Cried then. Not a soft ladylike weeping but a raw, guttural wail that echoed through the empty house. I cried for the boy who wanted to buy me a mansion. I cried for the widow who worked 3 jobs. I cried for the postal worker who believed that every story had a fair ending. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen shut. I was at the bottom of the well. I was in the void. The house felt like it was closing in on me. Every book on the shelves, every photograph on the shelf, every memory in the corners was a reminder of a failure I couldn't name. I had given him everything. And in doing so I had given him the power to destroy me. I had been so busy being his anchor that I never realized he was a ship that wanted to sink. I stayed on the floor for hours, the cold of the tile seeping into my bones. I watched the shadows of the trees dance on the ceiling, distorted by the streetlights outside. I felt like a ghost in my own life. I had been erased by my son, insulted by his mother-in-law, and used by a family of frauds. I was a footnote in a tragedy of vanity. But as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, a new feeling began to stir beneath the grief. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was a quiet, cold clarity. I was a postal worker. My job was to preserve the truth, to protect the records, to ensure that the facts remained unbent by the whims of the powerful. The Hartwell family wanted $65,000. They wanted my silence. They wanted my house. But they had underestimated the woman who had spent 35 years in the archives. They had forgotten that a postal worker knows where the bodies are buried because she's the one who filed the reports. I stood up, my joints cracking, my body feeling like it was made of rusted iron. I walked to the sink. I splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and puffy. My skin was pale, but the set of my jaw was firm. I wasn't just Linda Foster, the invisible mother. I was the keeper of the Foster history and I was done being a footnote. I looked at the phone. There was a new email. Not from Brian. From Richard Hartwell. Linda. Victoria tells me there's been some confusion. We value our relationship with Brian's family immensely. Let's resolve this quietly. I've scheduled a meeting with our financial advisors in Lake Oswego tomorrow afternoon. Brian mentioned you might need some assistance navigating the complexities of your retirement assets. We're happy to help you manage your funds so this bill can be settled without further stress. We'll pick you up at 2. They wanted to manage my funds. They were coming for the last of my marrow. I looked at the mountain, sharp and unyielding in the morning light. I realized then that they weren't coming to pick me up for a meeting. They were coming to see if the foundation had finally cracked. But as I stood in my kitchen, the gray light of Portland filling the room, I knew that the foundation wasn't made of marble or gold edges. It was made of 35 years of grit. And it was a lot stronger than they realized. I opened my laptop again. I didn't look at the tax problems this time. I looked at the names of the politicians and socialites on the wedding program. I began to cross-reference them with the Hartwell family's court history. Found a common thread. Pattern of unpaid debts, broken promises, and social climbing built on the backs of the unsuspecting. The Hartwell family weren't just frauds. They were a plague. And Brian had brought them to my door. The void was still there. A deep, dark hole in my heart where my son used to be. But the darkness was no longer empty. It was filled with a cold postal worker quiet purpose. I wasn't going to Hawaii. I wasn't going to a lunch. I was going to a meeting in Lake Oswego. And I was bringing the archives with me. I walked to the closet. I looked at the box containing the green dress. I didn't feel the urge to throw it away anymore. Pulled it out. I looked at the deep, beautiful green. It was the color of the forest that surrounded my city. Deep, cold, and capable of drowning those who didn't respect its power. I wasn't going to be the victim in their story. I was going to be the ending they never saw coming. I sat down and began to write. Not a check. Not an apology. I began to write a letter to my old friend, Marcus Chen. He was a retired accountant who specialized in financial investigations. He had been a regular at the post office for 25 years. A man who loved the truth as much as I did. Marcus, I wrote, I have a story that needs organizing. It's a tragedy of worthiness and debt. And I think it's time we investigated the Hartwell household. I looked out at the Portland morning. The fog finally lifting to reveal the jagged beauty of the city. The void was still there. But I was no longer falling. I was standing at the edge looking down. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was the one holding the light. The morning air in Portland was a sharp, biting cold that seemed to cut right through the craftsman's old wooden walls. I stood in my kitchen, watching the steam rise from my tea, my eyes fixed on the driveway. I had spent the last few hours of darkness sifting through digital files. But now, as the gray light finally took hold of the city, I needed a witness. I needed someone who understood the language of numbers as well as I understood the language of addresses. Marcus Chen was that man. He was 72 now. A retired financial investigator who had spent 25 years coming into the post office every Wednesday at 3 to mail his financial journals. We had shared 1,000 quiet conversations over the years. Two people who found comfort in the order of things. He in the ledgers and I in the mail routes. When his old blue truck pulled into the driveway at 9, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in days. It wasn't hope, not exactly. But it was solid ground. A bridge being built over the void. Marcus stepped out of the truck. His movements slow and careful. A thick leather bag clutched in his hand. He looked up at my house. Then at me standing on the porch. And he gave a single serious nod. He knew. He didn't know the details yet. But he knew the weight of a story that had gone wrong. Linda, he said as he reached the top step. His voice was like dry paper. Brittle but clear. You sounded like a woman who had found a ghost in the files when you called last night. I found a whole graveyard, Marcus, I replied, stepping back to let him in. Please. The kettle is on. We sat at the heavy wooden table in my dining room. The very table where I used to help Brian with his homework. The table where I had sat in silence for 2 days. Marcus didn't ask for background. He simply opened his bag and laid out his laptop. His fingers hovering over the keys with the muscle memory of a man who had spent a lifetime hunting for the truth hidden between the lines. I handed him the soggy wedding program I had picked up from the Columbia River House and the printouts of the court cases I had found. Brian's new family, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The Hartwell family. They say they are people of importance. They say they are worthy. Marcus adjusted his glasses. His eyes narrowing as he scanned the names. He didn't speak for a long time. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock in the hallway and the distant sound of cars on the street. I watched him work. his brow furrowing as he accessed databases I hadn't even known existed. The silence of the house felt different with Marcus there. It wasn't the silence of neglect anymore. It was the silence of a laboratory. Importance, Marcus finally murmured, a grim smile touching his lips. It's a fascinating word, Linda. In the financial world, importance is often just a fancy coat of paint on a crumbling wall. You found the tax problems, didn't you? The IRS doesn't care about aesthetic. They care about the fact that Richard Hartwell hasn't paid a dime in personal income tax since 2020. Is it as bad as I thought? Yes. Marcus turned the laptop toward me. It's worse. They aren't just broke, Linda. They are bankrupt. This house they hosted the wedding at, it's not theirs. It's owned by a shell company in Nevada that Richard is currently being sued by for fraud. They essentially squatted in a corporate building to stage a fantasy. The bank freeze Brian mentioned. That's not a freeze. It's a seizure order from a bankruptcy court in the Cayman Islands. They are a vacuum, Linda. A black hole that has been consuming the assets of anyone foolish enough to believe their lies. I felt the blood drain from my face. My son hadn't just married into a family of snobs. He had married into a ring of failures. And I was the next target. They want $65,000 for the catering and the venue, I said. They told Brian to ask me for a loan. Marcus let out a short, sharp laugh. A loan? That's rich. Linda, if you give them that money, you will never see a penny of it again. Not because they don't want to pay you back, but because they have nothing to pay you back with. Every dollar they have is claimed by 100 different creditors. They aren't looking for a loan. They are looking for a donor. They are looking for a mother who loves her son enough to set herself on fire to keep him warm. I looked at the wallpaper. The faded pattern I had once loved. I thought of Brian on the phone calling me selfish. I thought of him at the airport. His voice full of a stranger's arrogance. He believed the lie. He wanted the lie so badly that he was willing to see his mother as the villain in his story just to keep the Hartwell family as the heroes. The realization was a physical pain. A sharp ache in my bones. He wasn't just a victim of their con. He was an accomplice to his own delusion. They are coming here at 2, I told Marcus. Victoria and Richard. They said they want to manage my funds. They want to help me navigate my retirement assets. Marcus's eyes sharpened. They are going for the house, Linda. A craftsman in Portland, fully paid off. To people like the Hartwell family, that's not a home. It's collateral. They want to get their names on the deed or convince you to take out a reverse mortgage that they can skim from. They are desperate, and desperate people are very good at sounding like they are doing you a favor. I stood up. I walked to the window. The mountain was a spike of cold steel against the clouds. I realized then that my worthiness, the thing Brian kept talking about, had never been something I lacked. It was something they lacked. I had a life of integrity, a quiet labor, 35 years of service. I had a home that was bought with honest wages. I had a history that was documented in the post office's records and in the hearts of the people I had helped. I was the one who was worthy. They were the ones who were empty. What do I do, Marcus? Yes. I'm just a postal worker. Marcus stood up. He walked over to me. He placed a hand on my shoulder. His touch light but firm. You are not just a postal worker, Linda. You are a woman who knows how to find anything. You are a woman who knows that information is the only currency that never loses value. We aren't going to give them a check. We are going to give them a mirror. We spent the next 5 hours preparing. Marcus showed me how to organize the documents into a strategic sequence. We didn't just have tax problems. We had the names of the other mothers they had defrauded. We had the details of the lawsuit from the caterers in Eugene. We had the evidence of the squatting on the corporate house. Marcus helped me draft a series of questions. Questions that were designed to peel back the layers of the aesthetic until the rot was exposed to the light. As we worked, I felt the spark of self-respect that had flickered in the rain start to grow into a steady cold flame. I looked at the photos on the shelf. And for the first time, I didn't see a son I had lost. I saw a man who had made a choice. And choices have consequences. I wasn't going to be the silent bridge anymore. I was going to be the wall he finally hit. You need to wear the dress, Marcus said suddenly, pointing toward the box near the door. The wedding dress, gasped confused. The one I wasn't invited to wear. The one you bought for yourself, he corrected. Wear it. Not for them. For you. Show them that you aren't a vintage relic to be managed. Show them that you are the mistress of this house and that your worth is not a planning decision. I hesitated. Then I nodded. I went upstairs. I put on the green dress. Fit perfectly. The fabric cool against my skin. Put on the pearls. I looked in the mirror and I didn't see a widow who was sitting in a house waiting to be alone. I saw a woman who had survived the grease of the diner and the dust of the post office. I saw a woman who was armed with the truth. I came back downstairs and Marcus stood up. A look of genuine respect in his eyes. Linda Foster, he said softly. You look like the ending of a very important book. I feel like the beginning of one, Marcus, I replied. He left at 1:30, leaving his laptop and a folder of documents on the table. I'll be in my truck down the street, he said. If you need me, just open the front door. But I don't think you will. You've spent 35 years sorting the packages of the world. You know exactly how this one ends. I stood in the center of my living room. The silence of the house now filled with an electric strategic energy. I looked at the clock. 1:50. At 2, the Hartwell family would arrive in their black car. They would walk up my porch steps with their pitying smiles and their predatory intent. They would try to manage me. They would try to turn my retirement into their cash. I realized then that Brian's words, "The Hartwell family are people of importance," were the ultimate tragedy. He had confused fame for excellence and wealth for value. He had looked at the gold edges on the program and hadn't seen the soggy paper beneath it. He had wanted a mother who was an aesthetic, but he had a mother who was a vault. And today the vault was going to open. I went to the kitchen. I made a fresh pot of tea. I set out the cups. The good ones. The ones that had been in my family for generations. I didn't feel the phantom buzzing of the phone anymore. I didn't feel the weight of Brian's unworthy label. I felt like a postal worker who had finally found the missing package in a long dormant collection. I was ready. As I heard the sound of tires on the driveway at exactly 2, I didn't flinch. I stood by the window and watched Victoria Hartwell step out of the car. She was wearing a different coat today. A cream-colored wool that probably cost more than my first year of postal wages. Richard was with her. A tall man who carried himself with the stiff fake confidence of someone who had never actually earned the room he walked into. They looked like a magazine cover. They looked like the future Brian wanted. I took a deep breath, smoothing the green silk over my hips. I felt the weight of the pearls around my neck. A weight that felt like armor. I walked to the front door. I opened it before they could ring the bell. Linda, Victoria said. Her voice a trill of fake warmth. She looked at me. Her eyes widening slightly as they took in the dress and the set of my jaw. Oh, you look lovely. Are we going somewhere? We are, Victoria, I said. My voice sounding like the deep, steady tone of the post office bells. We're going to have a conversation about worthiness. Please come in. They walked into my home. Their eyes immediately scanning the room. Assessing the value of the furniture. The state of the paint. The cash of a woman they thought they had already conquered. I guided them to the dining room. To the table where Marcus's folders were laid out like a battle plan. Brian is so worried about you, Linda, Richard said, taking a seat without waiting to be asked. He told us you were having a difficult time with the wedding finances. We understand it's a lot to process at your age. But Victoria and I are here to help. We have a team in Lake Oswego that specializes in this kind of transition. A transition, I repeated. Sitting at the head of the table. That's an interesting word, Richard. Transition from what to what? Victoria leaned in. Her smile tight. From a house that's too big for you, dear. From assets that are just sitting there doing nothing. We can help you put that money to work for Brian. For Sarah. For the family you're finally a part of. I looked at her. At the surgical precision of her face. And I felt a deep sense of pity. She was a ghost haunting a life she couldn't afford. She was a con artist who had finally met a woman who knew how to check the records. I've been doing some research of my own, Victoria, I said, opening the first folder. I'm a postal worker, you see. I'm very good at finding things that people have tried to hide in the dark. The room went cold. Richard's confident posture shifted just a fraction. Victoria's smile faltered, her eyes darting to the folder. I found the tax problems, Richard, I continued, my voice calm and unwavering. I found the lawsuit from the caterers in Eugene. I found the seizure order on the cash Brian mentioned. Seems your problem is actually a collapse. And I'm curious, does Brian know? Does my son know that he's married into a family of shadows? Richard's face darkened. The fake confidence replaced by a sharp, desperate rage. You have no idea what you're talking about, Linda. You're a postal worker from a dusty suburb. You don't understand the complexities of high-level finance. I understand a catering bill, Richard, I said, leaning forward. And I understand that you're asking a 70-year-old widow to pay for a wedding you couldn't afford. I understand that you're trying to steal my home to pay for your vanity. And I understand that my worthiness is something you will never ever be able to afford. The silence that followed was complete. The mountain stood outside the window, a sentinel in the gray. I wasn't falling into the void anymore. I was the one holding the mirror. And for the first time in their lives, the Hartwell family was being forced to look at what was left when the aesthetic was stripped away. I was Linda Foster. I was a postal worker. And I was finally completely worthy of myself. The drive across the bridge toward Lake Oswego felt like crossing into a different country. Behind me lay Portland with its mist-covered hills and the honest chipping paint of my craftsman home. Ahead lay a city of glass buildings and perfect lawns. A place where wealth was the only language spoken. And where people like me were usually meant to be seen but not heard if we were seen at all. I sat in the back of the Hartwell family's black car. My green silk dress rustling against the leather seat. A sound that felt sharper than the silence inside the car. Richard was driving. His knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. Victoria sat beside him. Her neck rigid, staring straight out the windshield. The air in the car was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sharp metallic smell of desperation. They had come to my house to manage me. But I had brought them to Lake Oswego to end the story. I looked out at the gray water of the Columbia River. 20 years ago I had brought Brian to these shores for a picnic. We didn't have much. Just some peanut butter sandwiches and a bottle of lemonade. But we had spent the entire afternoon building a fort out of driftwood and rocks. I remembered his small, muddy hands as he piled stones on top of one another, declaring that it was a castle for the Queen of Packages. He had promised then that no dragon would ever touch me. Now the boy who built me a castle of driftwood was waiting in a high-end cafe, ready to burn my actual life down so he could keep his seat in a fortress made of debt. We arrived at the cafe, a place called the Golden Oak, which was exactly the kind of place where the Hartwell family felt they belonged. It was all floor-to-ceiling glass and gold accents, with servers who moved like silent shadows. Brian was already there, sitting at a corner table with Sarah. They were supposed to be in Hawaii. But the financial crisis had evidently dragged them back from paradise early. Brian looked exhausted, his expensive button-up shirt wrinkled, his hair messy. Sarah was huddled in her chair, her eyes red-rimmed, clutching a designer purse as if it were a life raft. When they saw me walk in with the Hartwell family, Brian stood up so quickly his chair scraped harshly against the marble floor. "Mom," he said, his voice a mix of relief and jagged defensive anger. "Thank God. Victoria said you were coming around. We've been sitting here for 3 hours waiting for the wire confirmation." I didn't sit down immediately. I stood at the edge of the table, looking at my son. This was the man I had raised. This was the result of 35 years of postal shifts and diner grease. He looked at me not with love but with the hollow, hungry eyes of a creditor. Sarah didn't even look up. She just stared at the table, her jaw set in a hard, entitled line. "Sit down, Linda," Victoria said, her voice reclaiming its trill of fake authority. "Let's get the banking details sorted so these children can get back to their lives." I placed the folder Marcus and I had prepared on the table. It was a simple manila folder, but it felt as heavy as a lead weight. Inside was the mirror. "Brian," I began, my voice steady, sounding as resonant as a bell in the sterile quiet of the cafe. "I've spent the last 4 days thinking about worthiness. You told me I wasn't worthy of your ceremony. You told me the Hartwell family were people of importance. You asked for $65,000 to fund an aesthetic that I didn't fit into." Brian sighed. Sharp, impatient sound. "Mom, we've been over this. It was a planning decision. Can we just talk about the transfer? The venue manager is threatening to call the police for theft of services. Sarah's father, Richard, is trying to help. But we need the cash now." I looked at Richard, who was leaning back in his chair, trying to project a calm he didn't possess. I looked at Victoria, whose hand was trembling as she reached for her coffee. "I'm not doing the transfer, Brian," I said. The silence that followed was complete. It was as if the music in the background had simply stopped. Brian's face turned a deep, dark red. Sarah finally looked up, her eyes wide and full of sharp predatory shock. "What?" Brian hissed, leaning across the table. "Mom, you promised. You said you'd look at the bill. Are you trying to destroy me? This is $65,000. If you don't pay this, our reputation in this city is finished. Sarah's family. They have a standard to uphold." "A standard?" I repeated, opening the folder. "Let's talk about that standard, Brian. Since you feel I'm too vintage to understand high-level finance, I had an old friend help me organize some records. I wanted to make sure I was being professional about my investment." I pulled out the first document, the IRS tax problem on Richard Hartwell's personal assets. I slid it across the table toward Brian. "Richard hasn't paid income tax in 5 years, Brian," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "His cash isn't frozen for a check. It doesn't exist. It hasn't existed for a very long time." Brian looked at the paper, his eyes darting across the numbers. He looked at Richard, then back at me. This must be a mistake. A clerical error." "There are no clerical errors in the archives, Brian," I said. I pulled out the next document, the foreclosure notice for the West Lynn property. "The house you were planning to buy. The one Victoria said was a family tradition. It's been in foreclosure since March. The Hartwell family aren't your benefactors, son. They are drowning. And they brought you into the water so they could use your mother as a float." Sarah stood up, her face a mask of fury. "How dare you? You're a postal worker. You're nothing. You have no right to dig into our private business. Brian, tell her to stop. Tell her to pay the bill and leave." "Sit down, Sarah," I said, not even raising my voice. The authority of 35 years of managing a public space was in that command. She sat, her mouth open in a silent, shocked gasp. I looked back at my son. "They squatted in a corporate building for your wedding, Brian. The house by the Columbia River isn't theirs. They are being sued for fraud by the holding company in Nevada. The $65,000 isn't a loan. It's the cost of a lie. And you wanted me to pay for it. You wanted me to empty my retirement so you could pretend to be someone you aren't for people who don't exist." Brian was staring at the folder now as if it were a snake. He looked at Victoria, who had turned away, her face hidden behind her perfectly styled hair. He looked at Richard, whose face was a gray, defeated void. The importance was gone. The aesthetic had been stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the debt. "Is this true?" Brian whispered, looking at Richard. "Richard, tell me this is a lie. Tell me she's just being stubborn." Richard didn't say anything. He just stared at his coffee. His shoulders slumped. The fake confidence finally completely gone. "It's true, Brian," I said. "And the most tragic part isn't that they are broke. It's that you believed that their lack of money made them more worthy than the mother who worked 3 jobs to put you through school. You thought that because they had the appearance of wealth, they were better than the woman who gave you the foundation to even stand in this room." "Mom, I didn't know," Brian said, his voice breaking. He looked like the 14-year-old boy in the black leather jacket again, small and lost and desperate to belong. "I just wanted to be part of something big. I wanted to make you proud." "Proud?" "Yes." A single sharp laugh escaping my lips. "You thought I would be proud of a son who hides his mother behind a plant at a party. You thought I would be proud of a man who calls his mother selfish for wanting to survive. You confused prestige for pride, Brian. And in doing so, you lost the only person who actually owned the room you were standing in." I pulled the invoice from the wedding planner out of my purse. The $65,000 demand. I placed it on top of the pile of tax problems and foreclosure notices. "Here," I said, sliding it toward him. "I'm not paying it. I'm not handling your problem. I am a retired postal worker, Brian. My cash is for my house, my healthcare, and my peace. If you want to fund this fantasy, you find the money or you tell the world the truth. You tell Marcus and the venue manager that the worthy Hartwell family is bankrupt. You tell your bride that the castle she wanted is a ruin." "Mom, please," Brian begged, reaching for my hand. Pulled it away. His touch felt like the same cold, manipulative pressure as Marcus's phone calls. "They'll take the house. They'll sue us. Our lives will be ruined before we even start." "Your lives have already started, Brian," I said. "They started with a betrayal. And they are continuing with a con. If you want to fix it, you start by being honest. You start by looking at your hands and realizing they aren't meant for champagne glasses they didn't earn. They are meant for work. The same work I did for 35 years. I stood up. I looked at Victoria and Richard Hartwell. They didn't look like magazine covers anymore. They looked like ghosts haunting a life that had already passed them by. "You should leave," I told them. "This house, my house in Portland, is no longer a resource for your transitions. My son's debt to your vanity is cancelled. But his debt to the truth is just beginning. I suggest you find a way to pay for the flowers before they rot." I turned to Brian. "I love the boy you were, Brian. I love the 14-year-old who wanted to buy me a mansion. But I don't know the man sitting in this chair. And until that man learns what worthiness actually looks like, I don't have a place in his story. And he certainly doesn't have a place in mine." I walked away. I didn't look back at the gold accents of the golden oak. I didn't look back at Sarah's tears or Richard's hollow rage. I walked out of the cafe and into the bright fake sunlight of Lake Oswego. The black car was still in the parking lot. A monument to a life of credit. But I didn't need it. I walked toward the bus stop. I sat on the bench. My green silk dress rustling against the cold plastic. I looked across the bridge toward Portland. The mountain was a sharp, honest silver against the clouds. I felt a deep sense of lightness. As if I had shed a skin that had been too tight for decades. I had faced the dragon. And it wasn't a monster. It was just a man in an expensive suit with a frozen bank account. The war was over. I had handed back the invoice. I had refused the guilt. I had purged the lie from my life. And as the bus pulled up, a hum of ordinary working-class reality, I felt a deep postal worker quiet joy. I wasn't worthy of their ceremony. And thank God for that. I was worthy of the truth. I got on the bus and sat by the window. I looked at the folder in my lap. The mirror I had held up to them. Marcus had been right. Information was the only currency that never loses value. I had $68,000 in the bank. I had a house that belonged only to me. And I had a heart that was finally, after 35 years of sorting the packages of others, starting to beat for itself. I remembered the smell of the post office one last time. The cardboard and the tape. I realized that the reason I loved packages was because they always had a destination where the truth had to be faced. Today was my destination. And the ending wasn't a $65,000 party. It was a woman sitting on a bus, heading home to a house that was hers, to a life that was honest, and to a silence that was no longer an echo of neglect but a song of freedom. The confrontation had been a purging. The Hartwell family was gone. Brian was left to face the consequences of his choices. And I, Linda Foster, was finally, for the first time in my life, the only author in the room. I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone. I saw a dozen missed calls from the wedding planner. I saw 100 texts from Brian. I didn't delete them. I simply selected them all and archived them. They weren't part of my current collection anymore. They were just old packages in a section I no longer visited. I looked out at the water as the bus crossed the bridge. The water was deep, blue, and unyielding. It didn't apologize for its waves. And neither would I. Worthiness wasn't a planning decision. It was a state of being. And I had never been more worthy than I was at that moment. Sitting in a green silk dress on a public bus. Heading back to the mist and the truth of my real life. The bus ride back to Portland felt like a slow rhythmic cleansing of my soul. I sat by the window, watching the city of Lake Oswego shrink into a cluster of glass and ego in the rearview mirror. As we crossed the bridge, the gray expanse of the Columbia River stretched out beneath us, its surface agitated by the lingering wind. I thought about the $65,000 still sitting in my account. For years I had guarded that money like a sacred treasure, believing it was the final proof of my devotion to Brian's future. I had seen it as a bridge I was building toward his happiness. But today I realized it was actually the price of my own ransom. I wasn't paying for a wedding. I was paying to remain a prisoner in a story where I was the only one following the rules. I got off the bus 4 blocks from my house. The rain had turned into a fine misting drizzle that tasted like salt and pine. I walked slowly, my green silk dress damp at the hem, the pearls heavy against my collarbone. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a survivor of a shipwreck who had finally reached the shore and realized she didn't need the cargo to breathe. The Craftsman looked different as I approached it. It wasn't just a vintage house in need of management. It was a fortress of truth. Every chipping flake of paint was a mark of a year lived with integrity. Every creak of the porch was a voice that belonged only to me. I went inside and didn't turn on the lights immediately. I sat in the darkness of the living room, listening to the house settle. For the first time in 40 years, the silence wasn't a weight. It was a canvas. I thought about Brian. I wondered if he was still sitting in the golden oak, staring at the wreckage of his worthiness. I wondered if Sarah had stopped crying long enough to realize that her family was a collection of shadows. A part of me, the mother who had scrubbed the grease of the diner tables, wanted to go back. She wanted to reach out, pay the bill, to fix the problem so her boy wouldn't have to feel the cold bite of reality. But that mother was a ghost now. She had died in the Lake Oswego cafe, buried under the weight of a son who called her selfish for wanting to exist. A week passed in a quiet postal worker-like order. Kept my phone off, tucked away in a drawer in the kitchen. I spent my days in the garden, pruning the roses that had been neglected during the months of the wedding drama. Marcus came over twice. We didn't talk much about the Hartwell family. We talked about his grandchildren, about the history of the Columbia River, and about the sheer undeniable beauty of a ledger that finally balanced. He told me over a cup of hot tea that the wedding planner had filed a lawsuit against the Hartwell house. He told me that Brian and Sarah had moved out of their luxury apartment and into a small rental in Gresham. The house in West Lynn had been a fiction, a carrot dangled by Victoria to keep Brian on the hook. The house of cards had collapsed exactly as Marcus had predicted, and Brian was at the center of the ruins. On the 12th day, I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't the aggressive, entitled knock of Victoria Hartwell. It was a hesitant, broken sound. I knew before I opened it who was standing on the porch. I went to the door, my heart steady, my jaw set. Brian stood there. He looked like he had aged 15 years in a week. The button-up shirt was gone, replaced by an old hoodie I remembered from his college days. His eyes were red, shadowed by a deep, hollow exhaustion. He didn't look like a man of importance. He looked like a boy who had finally realized that the suit he was wearing didn't have any pockets. "Mom," he said. His voice was cracked, stripped of the Lake Oswego arrogance. I didn't invite him in. I stood in the doorway, the mistress of the Foster Archives, guarding the entrance to my life. "Hello, Brian. I came to apologize," he said, looking at his shoes. "Everything you said was true. Richard and Victoria, they're being investigated for fraud. Sarah's father has been using my name on some of the shell companies. I might be liable for some of it. The wedding planner is suing us." Sarah left. She said she couldn't be married to someone who couldn't even provide a basic lifestyle. She went back to her cousin's house in California. I listened to him. And for the first time in his life, I didn't feel the urge to catch him. I didn't feel the phantom ache in my back from the post office trucks. I felt a cold, distant pity. "You traded your mother for a basic lifestyle, Brian. It seems the exchange rate wasn't in your favor." "Mom, please. I have nowhere else to go. They've frozen my personal accounts too because of the link to Richard's businesses. I can't even pay the rent on the place in Gresham. Can I stay here for a while? Just until I get back on my feet? You always said this was my home too." I looked at him, and I saw the 14-year-old boy. But I also saw the man who had asked me to drain my retirement so he could toast to people who hated the very sight of me. I thought about the lunch. More my speed. I thought about the plant at the engagement party. "No, Brian," I said. The word was a single clean cut. "This is not your home. This is Linda Foster's home. It's a house built on 40 years of postal shifts and 35 years of honest silence. It is not a resource for your transitions. It is not a safety net for a man who tried to cut the wires while I was standing on them. You're really going to turn your own son away after everything? You turned me away first, Brian. You turned me away from your wedding, from your family, and from your heart. You decided I wasn't worthy of the person you wanted to be. And I've decided that you aren't worthy of the peace I've finally found. I'll pay you back. I'll work. I'll do whatever it takes. I don't want your money, Brian. I have $68,000. Have my pension. Have my house. What I don't have is the energy to be the footnote in another one of your tragedies. You need to find your own worthiness now. Not Sarah's version. Not Victoria's version. And certainly not mine. You need to go out into the rain and learn how to build your own castle out of driftwood. And this time, don't ask your mother to pay for the stones. Close the door. I didn't lock it with a click of anger. I locked it with the quiet finality of a package being delivered to its proper address. I stood in the hallway and I didn't cry. I felt a sense of liberation that was almost dizzying. I had spent my life as an anchor. And I had finally realized that the ship I was holding was one that wanted to sink. By letting go, I wasn't just saving myself. I was giving him the only thing he actually needed. The opportunity to be real. The weeks turned into months. I didn't hear from Brian again. Not directly. Marcus told me he had taken a job as a warehouse loader for a shipping company in Beaverton. He was working 14-hour shifts. He was living in a small studio apartment. He was finally, for the first time in his life, paying his own bills. I hoped, in the quiet corners of my heart, that he was learning the scent of grease and the weight of honest labor. I hoped he was learning that a suit is just fabric. But integrity is the skin beneath it. I sold the green dress. I used the money to buy a first-class ticket to London. I realized that I had spent 35 years sorting the packages of others. And it was finally time to see the libraries of the world for myself. I spent 4 weeks in the British Library, breathing in the scent of centuries of stories. I walked through the ruins of Rome and realized that even the greatest empires fall when they are built on shadows. When I returned to Portland, the mist was still there, crawling over the mountain. But it didn't look like a ghost anymore. It looked like a veil being lifted. I sat in my garden, the roses in full bloom, and I realized that the scar on my heart was not a mark of shame. It was a mark of survival. It was the price I had paid to finally completely belong to myself. I looked at the mountain, sharp and unyielding against the clouds. I realized that my value was never a planning decision. It was never an aesthetic. It was a steady, quiet light that had been burning in the post office routes and the diner grease all along. I was Linda Foster. I was a postal worker. I was a survivor. And I was finally, for the first time in my 70 years, the only person who got to decide if I was worthy. The silence of my house was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of my own breath. A steady, honest rhythm that didn't owe a $65,000 debt to anyone. I had faced the void. And I had built a bridge out of the truth. The story was finally mine. True healing begins in the quiet wreckage of betrayal, where you finally realize that forgiving yourself for loving the wrong people is the hardest yet most necessary act of all. For decades I mistook sacrifice for duty and enabling for devotion, never seeing that by holding up a son who didn't want to stand, I was only teaching him how to lean until I broke. The light I found in the aftermath was not a gift from others, but a flame I had to strike myself in the cold darkness of my own house. I am no longer a footnote or an aesthetic. I am a woman who has reclaimed her narrative from those who tried to erase it. My worthiness was never a debt to be paid. It was a dignity I had to finally acknowledge.